An adventure game is a video game in which the player assumes the role of protagonist in an interactive story driven by exploration and puzzle solving. The genre's focus on story allows it to draw heavily from other narrative-based media such as literature and film, encompassing a wide variety of literary genres. Nearly all adventure games are designed for a single player, since this emphasis on story and character makes multiplayer design difficult. Colossal Cave Adventure is identified as the first such adventure game, first released in 1976. While other notable adventure game series include Zork, King's Quest, The Secret of Monkey Island, and Myst. Initial adventure games developed in the 1970s and early 1980s were text-based, using text parsers to translate the player's input into commands. As personal computers became more powerful with the ability to show graphics, the graphic adventure game format became popular, initially by augmenting players' text commands with graphics, but soon moving towards point-and-click interfaces. Further computer advancements led to adventure games with more immersive graphics using real-time or pre-rendered three-dimensional scenes or full-motion video taken from the first or third-person perspective. In the Western world, the genre's popularity peaked during the late 1980s to mid-1990s when many considered it to be among the most technically advanced genres, but was considered to be a niche genre in the early 2000s due to the popularity of first-person shooters and became difficult to find publishers to support such ventures. Since then, a resurgence in the genre has occurred, spurred on by success of independent video game development, particularly from crowdfunding efforts, starting with that of Broken Age in 2012, that showed a strong demand by players for adventure games. Within the Asian markets, adventure games continue to be popular in the form of visual novels, which make up nearly 70% of PC games released in Japan. The Asian markets have also found markets for adventure games for portable and mobile gaming devices. Definition: the term adventure game originates from the 1970s text computer game adventure, which pioneered a style of gameplay that was widely imitated and became a genre in its own right. The video game genre is therefore defined by its gameplay, unlike the literary genre, which is defined by the subject it addresses, the activity of adventure. Essential elements of the genre include storytelling, exploration, and puzzle solving. Adventure games have been described as puzzles embedded in a narrative framework, where games involve narrative content that a player unlocks piece by piece over time, while the puzzles that players encounter through the story can be arbitrary. Those that do not pull the player out of the narrative are considered examples of good design. Relationship to other genres: combat and action challenges are limited or absent in adventure games, thus distinguishing them from action games. In the book Andrew Rawlings and Ernest Adams on Game Design, the authors state that this reduced emphasis on combat doesn't mean that there is no conflict in adventure games, only that combat is not the primary activity. Some adventure games will include a mini-game from another video game genre, which are not always appreciated by adventure game purists. Of course, there are some games that blend action and adventure throughout the game experience. These hybrid action-adventure games involve more physical challenges than pure adventure games, as well as a faster pace. This definition is hard to apply, however, with some debate among designers about which games are action games and which involve enough non-physical challenges to be considered action-adventures. Adventure games are also distinct from role-playing video games that involve action, team building, and points management. Adventure games lack the numeric rules or relationships seen in role-playing games, and seldom have an internal economy. These games lack any skill system, combat, or an opponent to be defeated through strategy and tactics. However, some hybrid games exist here, where role-playing games with strong narrative and puzzle elements are considered RPG adventures. Finally, adventure games are classified separately from puzzle games. Although an adventure game may involve puzzle solving, they typically involve a player-controlled avatar in an interactive story. Game design. Puzzle-solving adventure games contain a variety of puzzles, such as decoding messages, finding and using items, opening locked doors, or finding and exploring new locations. Solving a puzzle will unlock access to new areas in the game world, and reveal more of the game story. Logic puzzles, where mechanical devices are designed with abstract interfaces to test a player's deductive reasoning skills, are common. Some puzzles are criticized for the obscurity of their solutions, for example the combination of clothesline, clamp, deflated rubber duck used to gather an item in The Longest Journey, which exists outside of the game's narrative and serves only as an obstacle to the player. Others have been criticized for requiring players to blindly guess, either by clicking on the right pixel, or by guessing the right verb in games that use a text interface. Games that require players to navigate mazes have also become less popular. Although the earliest text adventure games usually required players to draw a map if they wanted to navigate the abstract space. Gathering and using items. Many adventure games make use of an inventory management screen as a distinct gameplay mode. Players are only able to pick up some objects in the game, so the player usually knows that only objects that can be picked up are important. Because it can be difficult for a player to know if they missed an important item, they will often scour every scene for items. For games that utilize a point-and-click device, players will sometimes engage in a systematic search known as a pixel hunt. Games try to avoid this by highlighting the item, or by snapping the player's cursor to the item. Many puzzles in these games involve gathering and using items from their inventory. Players must apply lateral thinking techniques where they apply real-world extrinsic knowledge about objects in unexpected ways. For example, by putting a deflated inner tube on a cactus to create a slingshot, which requires a player to realize that an inner tube is stretchy. They may need to carry items in their inventory for a long duration before they prove useful, and thus it is normal for adventure games to test a player's memory where a challenge can only be overcome by recalling a piece of information from earlier in the game. There is seldom any time pressure for these puzzles, focusing more on the player's ability to reason than on quick thinking. Story, setting, and themes. Adventure games are single-player experiences that are largely story-driven. More than any other genre, adventure games depend upon their story and setting to create a compelling single-player experience. They are typically set in an immersive environment, often a fantasy world, and try to vary the setting from chapter to chapter to add novelty and interest to the experience. Comedy is a common theme, and games often script comedic responses when players attempt actions or combinations that are ridiculous or impossible. Since adventure games are driven by storytelling, character development usually follows literary conventions of personal and emotional growth, rather than new powers or abilities that affect gameplay. The player often embarks upon a quest, or is required to unravel a mystery or situation about which little is known. These types of mysterious stories allow designers to get around what Ernest W. Adams calls the problem of amnesia, where the player controls the protagonist but must start the game without their knowledge and experience. Story events typically unfold as the player completes new challenges or puzzles. But in order to make such storytelling less mechanical, new elements in the story may also be triggered by player movement, dialogue and conversation trees. Adventure games have strong storylines with significant dialogue, and sometimes make effective use of recorded dialogue or narration from voice actors. This genre of game is known for representing dialogue as a conversation tree. Players are able to engage a non-player character by choosing a line of pre-written dialogue from a menu, which triggers a response from the game character. These conversations are often designed as a tree structure, with players deciding between each branch of dialogue to pursue. However, there are always a finite number of branches to pursue, and some adventure games devolve into selecting each option one by one. Conversing with characters can reveal clues about how to solve puzzles, including hints about what that character would want before they will cooperate with the player. Other conversations will have far-reaching consequences, such as deciding to disclose a valuable secret that has been entrusted to the player. Characters may also be convinced to reveal their own secrets, either through conversation or by giving them something that will benefit them. Goals, success and failure. The primary goal in adventure games is the completion of the assigned quest. Early adventure games often had high scores, and some, such as Zork, also assigned the player a rank, a text description based on their score. High scores provide the player with a secondary goal, and serve as an indicator of progression. While high scores are now less common, external reward systems such as Xbox Live's achievements perform a similar role. The primary failure condition in adventure games, inherited from more action-oriented games, is player death. Without the clearly identified enemies of other genres, its inclusion in adventure games is controversial, and many developers now either avoid it or take extra steps to foreshadow death. Some early adventure games trapped the players in unwinnable situations without ending the game. Infocom's text adventure, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, has been criticized for a scenario where failing to pick up a pile of junk mail at the beginning of the game prevented the player, much later, from completing the game. The adventure games developed by LucasArts purposely avoided creating a dead-end situation for the player due to the negative reactions to such situations. Subgenres: text adventure, interactive fiction. Text adventures convey the game's story through passages of text, revealed to the player in response to typed instructions. Early text adventures, such as Colossal Cave Adventure, Hugo's House of Horrors, and Scott Adams' games, used a simple verb-noun parser to interpret these instructions, allowing the player to interact with objects up to basic level, for example by typing "get key" or "open door." Later text adventures, and modern interactive fiction, can interpret far more complex sentences like "take the key which is on the desk, then open the door." Notable examples of advanced text adventures include most games developed by Infocom, including Zork and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. With the onset of graphic adventures, the text adventure fell to the wayside, though the medium remains popular as a means of writing interactive fiction, which tend to be focused more on the narrative through player exploration and discovery rather than puzzle solving. Graphic adventure. Graphic adventures are adventure games that use graphics to convey the environment to the player. Games under the graphic adventure banner may have a variety of input types, from text parsers to touchscreen interfaces. Point-and-click adventures are a common type of graphic adventure in which the player uses a pointer, typically a mouse, to interact with the environment and solve puzzles. This input method remains popular in the genre, and is well suited to interaction with the environment, as opposed to direct control schemes which emphasize character control. Graphic adventure games will vary in how they present the avatar. Some games will utilize a first-person or third-person perspective where the camera follows the player's movements, whereas many adventure games use a context-sensitive camera that is positioned to show off each location to the best effect. There are a number of subtypes of graphical adventure games, though these definitions may be loose and a game may belong to one or more of these. For example, the Ace Attorney series of games, while presenting itself as a visual novel, includes elements of point-and-click adventure games. Another notable example is the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes series, which have elements of point-and-click to solve puzzles and cases. Point-and-click adventure games. Point-and-click adventure games are those where the player typically controls their character through a point-and-click interface using a mouse or similar pointing device. though additional control schemes may also be available. The player clicks to move their character around, interact with non-player characters, often initiating conversation trees with them, examine objects in the game's settings or with their character's item inventory. Many point-and-click games would include a list of on-screen verbs to describe specific actions in the manner of a text adventure, but newer games have used more context-sensitive user interface elements to reduce or eliminate this approach. Often, these games come down to collecting items for the character's inventory and figuring where is the right time to use that item. The player would need to use clues from the visual elements of the game, descriptions of the various items, and dialogue from other characters to figure this out. Escape the room games. Escape the room games are a further specialization of point-and-click adventure games. These games are typically short and confined to a small space to explore, with almost no interaction with non-player characters. Most games of this type require the player to figure out how to escape a room using the limited resources within it and through the solving of logic puzzles. Other variants include games that require the player to manipulate a complex object to achieve a certain end in the fashion of a puzzle box. These games are often delivered in Adobe Flash format and are also popular on mobile devices. Examples of the subgenre include the Submachine series, MOTAS, and The Room. Puzzle adventure games. Puzzle adventures are adventure games that put a strong emphasis on logic puzzles. They typically emphasize self-contained puzzle challenges with logic puzzle toys or games. Completing each puzzle opens more of the game's world to explore, additional puzzles to solve, and can expand on the game's story. There are often few to none non-playable characters in such games, and lack the type of inventory puzzles that typical point-and-click adventure games have. Puzzle adventure games were popularized by Myst and The Seventh Guest. Both used mixed media consisting of pre-rendered images and movie clips. But since then, puzzle adventure games have taken advantage of modern game engines to present the games in full 3D settings. Myst itself has been recreated in such a fashion. Other puzzle adventure games are casual adventure games made up series of puzzles used to explore and progress the story, exemplified by the Professor Layton series of games. Exploration games. Exploration games are narrative-focused adventures that allow players to experience their story through exploration and discovery. Like visual novels, they are story-focused and feature fewer puzzles or even no puzzles at all. They allow players to roam around an environment freely and often tell their story through discovering elements like books, journals, or clues rather than through dialogue and cutscenes as in more traditional adventure games. As puzzles are de-emphasized, story and atmosphere are placed at the forefront. The lack of any traditional gameplay sometimes leads to these types of games being called by the derogatory term, walking simulators. Some examples of exploration games include Gone Home, Dear Esther, The Stanley Parable, Jazzpunk, and 30 Flights of Loving. Visual novel. A visual novel is a hybrid of text and graphical adventure games, typically featuring text-based story and interactivity aided by static or sprite-based visuals. They resemble mixed media novels or tableau vivant stage plays. The format has its primary origins in Japanese and other Asian video game markets, typically for personal computers and more recently on handheld consoles or mobile devices. The format has not gained much traction in Western markets. A common type of visual novel are dating sims, which has the player attempt to improve a relationship with one or more other characters. Interactive movie. Some adventure games have been presented as interactive movies. These are games where most of the graphics are either fully pre-rendered or use full motion video from live actors on a set, stored on a media that allows fast random access such as Laserdisc or CD-ROM. The game's software would present a scene and then display options for the player to continue on. the choice leading to the game playing a new scene from the media. The video may be augmented by additional computer graphics. Under a Killing Moon used a combination of full-motion video and 3D graphics. Because these games are limited by what has been pre-rendered or recorded, there is a lack of player interactivity in these titles, with wrong choices or decisions leading quickly to an ending scene. Interactive movies have seen a larger growth with the advancement of computing power that can render pre-scripted scenes in real time, thus providing for more depth of gameplay that is reactive to the player, but still following a pre-written story. Such games include Quantic Dream's Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain, and many of Telltale Games' episodic adventure series such as The Walking Dead. Action-adventure game. While most adventure games typically do not include any time-based interactivity by the player, action-adventure games are a hybrid of action games with adventure games that often require the player to react quickly to events as they occur on screen. The action-adventure genre is broad, spanning many different subgenres, but typically these games utilize strong storytelling and puzzle-solving mechanics of adventure games among the action-oriented gameplay concepts. The foremost title in this genre was Adventure, a graphic home console game developed based on the text-based Colossal Cave adventure, while the first, The Legend of Zelda, brought the action-adventure concept to a broader audience.